5 mixing tips for a more professional, polished, and explosive sounding snare drum. And we'll get to it all after this introduction.
Latch them softly.
Welcome everybody, I'm Dan Spencer, and I am the Audio Sorcerer. So this is the channel where I teach you how to perfect your audio recording, mixing, and mastering skills. So before we get to the video, make sure you guys smash that like button. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell to know when I have new videos coming out. So without further ado, today we are talking about some snare drum mixing tips that are going to take your snare drum sound to the next level. So these are a combination of actual mixing techniques to actual things that are problem solving, okay? So if you don't have the best snare drum recording or you're working with samples, some of these things are going to help problem solve that. And some of them are actually just some overall techniques, okay? So before we get to all that, I do want to mention to check out my website, audiosorcerer.com. So I offer all kinds of services from audio mixing and mastering to also audio editing. And there's also a blog on there full of great articles and also a lot of techniques that I don't talk about on the YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe to the blog for new articles. So with all that being said, let's get into today's topic and let's look at our first technique, which is utilizing your room microphones and your overhead microphones. The first tip to getting a professional explosive snare sound is to utilize the room microphones and the overhead microphones. So these microphones are going to do a really good job of capturing the body of the snare and then also, of course, the room sound. So the mics that we put directly on the snare are going to get that nice close sound, and then we want to blend this in with the room and overhead microphones. So what you need to decide is, based upon your song, is do you want a more roomy snare sound or a more direct snare sound? So if you're mixing a dirty blues song, which is just maybe drums, bass, guitar, and vocals, you're probably going to want a more roomy snare sound, as opposed to if you're mixing a pop song, you're probably going to want a more direct snare sound. Okay, so let's take a listen to this song here, which is a rock song, and then we'll talk about what I decided to do in this mix. All right, so let's give it a listen. All right, so in this particular drum mix, there are 5 room tracks and there are 2 overhead tracks. And as you could hear, the snare is not very present in them. It's actually pretty dull. So that's actually forcing me to utilize the direct snare tracks over here, which is actually 3 of them. So that was kind of a decision I had to make. I'm like, well, what do I have to work with? So in this situation, I had no choice but to utilize the snare tracks here. So that's kind of decisions you got to make. It's like, what type of song is it? What do I have to work with? What sounds best in the end, okay? So overall, from this section here, take 2 things away from it. First thing is do top-down mixing. So start with the overheads and room mics, and then add your kick, snare, and toms. And then decide, are you going to have a roomier snare or a direct snare? And obviously the recording and genre is going to kind of dictate that for you. All right, so let's move on to our tip number 2, which is adding saturation to the snare drum. Tip number 2 for getting a professional explosive snare sound is to add saturation to it. Now, the type of song you're working with is going to determine how much or little saturation you want to add. So one of my favorite saturation plugins for the snare drum is Hollywood, which is in the Slate VMR. And I do have a link in the description below where you can purchase the Slate VMR if you end up liking this plugin. So the reason that this plugin is so good is it emulates tube saturation. and it has a nice balance between the low mids and upper mids. So my opinion for snare, you need to have a good balance between those two frequency ranges. You don't want a saturation plugin that focuses on, maybe the upper mids. That's more crunchy, okay? We don't really want that. We want something that's going to add some beef and some sizzle to the snare all in one, and this plugin is great for that. So let's give it a listen here. So I'm going to start with the bypass and then I'll bring it in. You're going to hear a pretty good difference with this plugin. All right, so let's give it a listen. All right, so pretty awesome. So this saturation gives the snare a much fuller body sound. It makes it more aggressive and even brings out some of the sizzle in it. So again, this is the Hollywood in the Slate VMR. So let's move on to tip number 3, which is using a Distressor compressor limiter emulation. Step number 3 to getting a professional explosive snare sound is to use a Distressor compressor limiter emulation. In this situation, I'm using the Slate FG Stress, which also comes in the Slate VMR. So this is very simple to use here. So we are looking to use it more for coloration, not so much compression. So I'm just using a 2-to-1 ratio here, and I'm getting probably about 1 to 2 dBs of gain reduction. That is it. Now, the main thing that's going to give us our coloration for the snare is setting this to dist 3, which is actually distortion 3, okay? And this is going to add a third harmonic to the sound. And it makes a huge difference. It really sounds great on snare, all right? So let's actually give this a listen. I'll start with the bypass and then I'll bring it in. All right, so we're definitely getting a more explosive sound with the FG Stress enabled, and with Distortion 3 engaged, we're getting more color, we're getting more character, and overall we're dirtying up the sound just the way I like it. So that is tip number 3. So let's move on to tip number 4, which is high shelf EQ. Tip number 4 for getting a professional explosive snare drum sound is to utilize a high shelf EQ. Now, you want to make sure that you use the right EQ and that you set the high shelf frequency right, and then of course that you apply the right amount of gain. So in my situation here, I'm using the FGA, which is right here. This is emulating an API EQ. Now, I have the high shelf set to 12.5 kilohertz, okay? So I have it quite high up here. Not all EQs go this high, but that's one thing I love about this EQ, that it goes all the way up to 20 kilohertz. So it's pretty crazy. I have it boosted 6 dBs, which is a pretty good boost. Now, let you hear what this sounds like with a bypass and then brought in, and you're going to hear how much power it gives the snare. This is really where a lot of that, I want to say, attack and just snap comes from when you add this here. So let's give it a listen. All right, so I think that this probably made the biggest difference to our snare track here than any of the other plugins that I showed you so far. So adding these really high frequencies here added almost like some thunder into this snare and some of the actual snares. You can hear them better now. So you need to determine, listening to your particular snare recording, do you need these frequencies, more of them, or do you already have enough of them? Okay, so that's something that you got to determine yourself when you're mixing your snare. So that is tip number 4. Let's move on to our last tip here, tip number 5, which is to utilize a overall parallel compression of the drum mix. Step number 5, our last and final step in making this snare drum sound professional and explosive, is to apply parallel compression to the drum bus. Well, actually what we're going to do is we are sending a copy of the drum bus to a parallel aux track, which we have in Pro Tools. And on this parallel aux track, we are applying the Slate VMR, which you see open here. And I'm actually just using a preset called Drum Crusher 1. Now, most of the time I just leave this set as is. So these are my current settings right here in the preset. Most of the time, if I change anything, it's just some of the gain staging in it here, okay? The idea is that we are going to smash these drums as much as we can, and then we're going to blend them in with the, non-affected drums. So we're going to smash them to bring some life to them. So you can actually squeeze some life into instruments. You don't really hear people say that because if you're doing it in a parallel way, you're not actually squeezing the, direct track. If you were squeezing the direct track, yeah, you're going to squeeze the life out of it. But in this scenario here, since we're going to be blending it in, we control how much we blend in. So with that being said, let's start with this bypassed, and then I'll bring it in. And I want you to listen just to the snare. Don't listen to all the other instruments. Just listen to the snare and hear the difference that it makes. All right, so let's give it a listen. All right, pretty cool. It's a little bit subtle because I don't have it extremely loud in there, but it does make quite a bit of difference in just adding that extra polish to the overall drum mix, and then of course the snare. All right, so that is our 5 tips for how to make your snare drum sound better, more professional, explosive, polished, all of those things and above. So if you guys ended up liking this video, give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe because I'm making this content for you, and hit that notification bell to know when I have new videos coming out. And if you guys enjoyed this topic, definitely check out my review of the Slate VMR where I go over every module in it. All right? And with that being said, until the next video, I will see you guys later, and peace out.